Hi, everybody. I'm Suzette Martinez Standring, and welcome to It's All Right with Suzette, where today we are featuring Bob Halloran, and he is a news and sports anchor with WCVB TV, an ABC affiliate, and Emmy Award-winning journalist. And today we're going to talk about his book, White Devil, the true story of the first white Asian crime boss. So, Bob, thank you for coming here today.
I always have a good time here.
Well, you know, I've read your book, and it is really fascinating to read about John Willis and his rise through the Asian Mafia in Boston as a white man.
Yeah, that was the hook to the whole thing. When I didn't know anything about John Willis, I was covering the Whitey Bulger trial back in the summer of 2013, and John was in Plymouth in jail awaiting sentencing for selling OxyContin and conspiracy to sell drugs and those types of things. And so when the idea was presented to me, it was white guy in an Asian gang. You go, wow, how did that happen?
Exactly.
And so then the other part that I thought was interesting was that I would have an opportunity to interview John. So it's a chance to kind of like delve into the mind of the criminal and understand him. And so spending 7 hours with him in Cumberland, Maryland, where he ultimately was sent to serve his 20 years, it gave me a chance to do a little bit of a psychological profile of a criminal. So you have that juxtaposed with all the action and the drama and the murders and the violence and the drugs.
Now, you said that when you heard about his story, how did you actually hear about John Willis?
Well, our friend Steve Davis.
Oh, yeah.
I was writing the book.
My neighbor.
Yeah, I was following the story about Whitey Bulger and Steve Davis and his sister, who was killed by either Bulger or Flemmi or both, and doing that story. And he knew John. I think I could say they were friends. They were more than just acquaintances. So he mentioned that this was kind of an interesting story. And my manager, Matt Valentinus, visited with John, sold his life rights to Warner Brothers. So now there's a movie in the works. And then came to me and said, do you want to write the book? And I said, yeah, sure, let's do that.
Well, when I read the book, I thought it was really fascinating because John Willis grew up here and very poor, almost pretty much an abandoned child in a lot of ways, and through a series of circumstances gets taken in by this Chinese family that happens to be involved with the mafia.
Yeah, it was such a strange set of circumstances that created this, because John has grown up in Dorchester, and at the beginning of his life, it's pretty good. Now, his father was an alcoholic and left the family at age 3, so that's not a great part. But he's being raised by a single mom and his much older brother upstairs of a triple-decker in Dorchester. They've got some cash, you know, they're doing okay. He's got new clothes and new shoes for school. He's playing hockey. He's 14 years old, and all of a sudden his mom gets diabetes. Her legs are amputated after a visit to the hospital, and now John, at the age of 14, has to care for her. By the time he's 15, she passes away, and nobody really takes care of him. He drops out of the system, falls through the cracks. There's no Department of Child Services that makes sure he goes to school. His sisters and his brother has since passed away, and his sisters have no interest in raising him. So now it is a very desperate circumstance. He can't buy food, he can't heat the house, he can't take care of himself. And he does get a job as a bouncer in a bar in Kenmore Square at the age of 16, and lying about his age. And he's big and strong now. He's been using steroids and working out. He was trying to be a bodybuilder. And one night he helps a Chinese guy named Wo-Ping Joe out of a scrape. Wo-Ping Joe hands him a card with a phone number on it and says, if you ever need anything, give me a call. And one night, sometime after that, John calls him and from a payphone on Furnace Brook Parkway. And like 2 cars with 10 Chinese guys show up, and next thing he's taken to a house. He meets a lot of other Chinese people. The next day he's taken to a restaurant in Chinatown, and boom, he's a member of the gang. It just happened that quickly, and he, you know, navigated that new environment really well, learned how to speak Chinese, took to the violence, took to the, you know, criminality of the whole thing, to the point where he was no longer a follower. At some point he became a leader. You
know, that period of time when in his teens, I mean, when you write about I think of it as abandonment, right?
Yeah.
Everybody who could care for him and everybody he ever cared for is dead and gone, and he's just homeless,
Right.
on the brink of homelessness, so young and so desperate, and calls, that man, and boom, the car, like you say, the car shows up and everything. I'm really fascinated because on one hand, his whole career is about intimidation
Yep.
and crime. And yet what drives him is this sense of family. He has this loyalty to this Chinese family that took him in.
Right.
And so basically, whatever they asked him to do, he did it. So what was that like when you were you talk about the psychological profile, and you really handle that so beautifully in the book. What was it like talking to him when you can see the just the difference between
Right.
those two sets of thinking?
Well, I got a sense of honesty from John and also hypocrisy.
Yes.
Because he was abandoned, and family means everything to him. And so his brothers in the gang, the Chinese families that took him in, his friends, his cohorts in crime, he's loyal to them. He won't rat on them. He'll do anything for them. He falls in love with a woman who he calls his wife, but he didn't marry her. She has a daughter that he calls his daughter, but he didn't adopt her. So there's that kind of push and pull where he feels like a need for family, and yet he cheats on. He's not the world's best father as far as like
Yes.
leaving the daughter, having a gun on him when she's on his lap, things like that. You kind of go. So there's an awful lot that I argued with John when we had our conversation, and I enjoyed that very much. He's a very bright guy. He's very well read. He's philosophical, and yet I wanted to understand when he says God loves me and I'm going to heaven. And I say, but you did these violent things, you sold drugs, you ruined people's lives, and he has an answer for everything. And so then I push him a little bit further, because I'm thinking, it's not as black and white as you're making it. But he does have an answer for everything, and I thought it was interesting to delve into that.
Now, when you first went to Maryland to meet him, what was that like initially? You have to develop a rapport with the person that you're interviewing. He doesn't know you from Adam, except perhaps through Steve Davis. How difficult was it to get him to open up?
It was instantaneous. It
Was
really
it?
was. And I'm very proud of myself to this extent that I wasn't nervous. I wasn't intimidated. This big, strong guy in an orange jumpsuit walks into a room, and I'm the only one in it. He sits down, and I've got a list of questions, and we start going through them, and he's just talking, and he's open. And I found out later he was very honest with me. The stories that he told, I was able to verify. So that felt good. But, in different times in the conversation, we talked about the Red Sox, we talked about politics, and in the meantime, he's telling me all these other things. And, I always, when I go out and talk about the book now, I tell people, if I didn't know about his past, you can't separate from that.
Right.
He's a bad guy. But the person I met and spoke with for 2 days and 7 hours, I liked him. He's very smart. He's challenging. He pushes you. He makes you think. And he was nice. He was soft-spoken. He never got angry. And like I say, to talk to him for 4 hours the first day, I was never bored. Neither one of us got up to go to the bathroom or get a drink or anything. The time flew.
Wow.
And so I thought it was one of the first times I had a chance to do something like that. I've never interviewed a prisoner before. I haven't done too much with the true crime genre. And so to meet him and to like him and to email him back and forth was pretty nice.
That's so interesting. Can you describe what he looks like? You say he's big,
Yeah.
but for the viewers, so they can get an idea of what
He's a
John
handsome
Willis-
guy. He's got kind of a cropped haircut, kind of like, I guess you might think of a state trooper with
Yes.
the crew cut. He's solid. He's still very strong, but he's not ginormous. He might be 6 feet, 6'1", in the 220 range. He's got, Paul Newman's eyes. It's like
Wow.
it's odd to describe him that way, but yeah, I mean, he looks like somebody who would come from Dorchester, that kind of rounded face. He's part Cherokee,
Right.
part Irish, something else in
Portuguese,
there.
I think.
Right, Portuguese,
You said.
I think,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so he's got kind of a nice mix and everything, you know, and a nice guy.
How you say he's in? How old is he? He's doing 20 years.
I would say he's 44 now. I think maybe 45. He'll be 45 in May. I believe that's what it is.
And has he cut all ties with the mafia, or?
No. It's interesting. As I tell his story in his late teen and early 20s, we're in the 90s now. He's very involved in what's happening in Chinatown, the gambling houses, the brothels, extorting money from the businesses. But when he started to get a little bit greedier, in fact, the first time he went to prison, he came out with a lot of drug contacts. So I do tell people that's
right, exactly.
that's one of the things that's happening in our prisons, because each time he went in,
it's a training ground.
Yeah, each time he went in, he came out with more.
Exactly.
And so the first time he came out, he started selling marijuana, heroin, ecstasy, cocaine. Second time he went in, he came out with new contacts for OxyContin in Florida, and he started doing that. So by this time, and in Chinatown, the way John tells it, they didn't like drugs, they didn't want drugs there. Mm-hmm. So if he was going to sell drugs, he'd have to do that outside. So that kind of created a little bit of a separation. So he's still connected, still has friends, still has a loyalty to people in Chinatown, but he wasn't really working with them by the time the police got him for this.
This is really interesting. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to talk to Bob Halloran about the Asian Mafia, because that's really covered so well in his book, and I found it so fascinating. It's a very interesting history of the Asian crime mafia in Boston. So we'll be back in a few seconds. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning back in to It's All Right with Suzette, where we are talking to Bob Halloran, author of White Devil, the true story of the first white Asian crime boss. And on the second half, I'd really love to talk to you about the history of the Boston Asian Mafia. And for one of the things that I learned in your book is that the background is the Benevolent Society
right.
and tongs. And maybe we could just have a little bit of a primer on that, what it is.
Yeah, because there's a legitimate and illegitimate part of the gangs. You say gang and all of a sudden it's a bad thing.
Right.
But they're also involved in helping out businesses, and you do have the triads and the tongs that are legitimate. But the way I learned it and the way John explained it, and through the research it seems to make sense. You have a lot of Asian people, Chinese, Vietnamese, coming to the United States. They don't have collateral, they don't have cash.
Exactly.
So, and they also can't get a loan from the bank. So they go to the triads, the gangs, and borrow money. Now, it's not the typical way you borrow money from a bank and you pay back the loan in 20 or 30 years. You're now indebted to them forever. And that's the part that becomes part of the system, and the business owners who open up and pay their monthly dues, that works out fine. When they decide that they don't want to pay anymore, that's when somebody like John steps in and makes sure that they do. And so the loan seemed legitimate when it was issued, but then the extortion after the fact is where it sort of steps over the line. But John was very clear in that in Chinatown, when the gangs were there wasn't a whole lot of crime. You know, he says that they did a better job of protecting people than the police would do, because you know, if you've got 60 Asian guys walking around town, there's nobody that's going to like mug an old lady or steal a purse or rob a store or anything like that. So they controlled that, but they were the criminals. So that's part of the inconsistency of John's argument and everything. But very quickly, the reason I got into that was because people would say, well, how did John get to be you know, the second most powerful man in Chinatown? How did this white guy get to the top? And so that sort of forced me into understanding how the hierarchy worked in Chinatown and who the boss was. And so his most immediate boss was a guy named Bai Ming. Well, Bai Ming ended up being the head of Chinatown sort of by accident. It started with a guy named Sky Dragon, nicknamed Sky Dragon, and Stephen C. is his name. And he went to Chinatown and left a vacancy. Went to Chinatown, went to China
Yes.
to avoid prosecution here. And there's a vacancy at the top of the Chinese gang called Ping An, and he didn't leave anybody to take over. So now there's a war at the top. There's a couple of murders that take place. Bai Ming is kind of off to the side, not getting too involved in all that stuff. And by the time the shootouts are done and people are dead and the whole bit, Bai Ming's the last man standing. And John Willis is standing right next to him.
Because I think your book is probably one of the rare books that actually covers that kind of history almost as an Asian crime syndicate genealogy.
Yeah, and I was happy to be able to do that as a tangent to the John Willis story. When I initially started getting into it, I go, am I veering off too far from John's story? But I sort of need to tell this to make sure people understand what's happening in Chinatown, how John is working around all of that stuff, and how he ends up in the position that he's at. And I did find it interesting myself as far as who was vying for power. Guys from San Francisco were coming here. There was a massacre on Tyler Street in Chinatown where 5 people were killed. And I get into that because John knew the main target of that assassination and had breakfast with him the day before and all these. So he was always in and around all this stuff. And ultimately, I hope that because I was interested in it, I could write it well enough that the reader would be interested in it.
Well, you certainly conveyed that interest. And it's very complicated because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of players, but I think you did a really good job of being clear about who these people are. And what I loved about it was that it gave me an insider's view into the way these benevolent society triads, gangs functioned, because you talk about how in the beginning many of these immigrants can't get loans or whatever, and so that these benevolent societies were developed basically to protect and support and help their own.
Right.
Over time, the corruption sets in, and then the violence starts to take place. And what was really interesting to me is that in the beginning, you talk about how it had a history of mainly Chinese. It was Chinese. And then the Vietnamese gangs start to come in and infiltrate and bring more violence because there is I guess, a combative kind of relationship between them. But you're naming names and you're doing all this insider's information, and I wondered, is the Asian crime syndicate pretty much eradicated, or do you think that people are looking at you and saying, you're giving up all our secrets?
Yeah, I felt actually, I was a little nervous about that, and the book comes out, and what's John's reaction going to be, and the whole bit. And there's a gentleman that I met after the fact. His name is Adam Cheong, and he writes a blog in Chinatown, and he's lived there, and his parents were semi-involved in different things, and he knows all the characters, and he knows the history. And he just, after the book came out, he emailed me, and we had breakfast together one day, and I was very happy to hear from him that I got it right, and that following the history and the genealogy and the whole bit for the time period that I was concentrating on, that it was accurate. He did tell me that I could have gone further back to where it actually started, but according to what I've learned after the fact, the Chinese gang structure right now in Boston's Chinatown is not as established the way it was. It was organized back when. And around the time that John was being looked into by the FBI and other prosecutors for selling drugs, that's when they were finally in the early 2000s and into maybe 2010, 11, 12, they started looking into this whole thing and breaking it up a little bit. My read on it was that the police didn't care that much about the gambling houses. They're playing mahjong and things in the backs of restaurants, and okay, fine, nobody's getting hurt, and it's that kind of thing. It was the brothels that I think got their attention, because that seemed to me to be very close to slave trading.
Sex trafficking.
Yeah, sex trafficking. They were bringing women up from New York. They'd spend a month here in the Boston area and other suburbs, and then they'd send them out to Chicago, and then they'd send them and the women didn't really have a choice in this. So that's really how John got caught. He went to a brothel, had a meeting, just with a guy who's named in the book, etc. And John leaves in a yellow Porsche. And the police are like, well, what's happening there? And they follow the Porsche, and they see a transaction of some sorts with a paper bag. And so now they're on to John, and they start to wiretap him. He's got 5 burner phones, and they followed him for the better part of, I'd say, 18 months or so before they built a strong enough case to pressure him into taking a deal.
So in all your research about gang activity and the history of it in Boston, did it lead you to believe that anything might be going on in North Quincy, where there's such a large Asian demographic there?
Well, I think that it's still going on to some extent, but less structured, I believe. Even John's little joke when I asked him, I said, so you were in the Ping-On gang? And he goes, yeah, but it's not like we were wearing T-shirts, So, they were under the umbrella of Ping-On, and there was a hierarchy and leadership and a lot of people underneath. And nowadays, I don't think that they go by the same names or work the same way. The leadership has kind of like disbanded to some extent. But in my conversations with John, I didn't really get into the specifics of what's going on in Chinatown and North Quincy in this area now, because he was less involved in it. So I'm still following his story, and his story took me more toward Florida, where the pill mills were accessible to people who wanted to get OxyContin, oxycodone for like $4 a pill, ship it up to the Boston area and sell it for $20 a pill on Cape Cod and other things like that. So I do believe that indirectly and maybe directly, John's involved in the opioid crisis that we're talking about now on Cape Cod and other suburban areas, because he sold a lot of pills, especially on Cape Cod.
Well, Bob's going to be speaking at the Milton Public Library on April 28th, and so I hope you all have a chance to come out and see him at this wonderful free event where he's going to sign books. And in the few moments that we have left, I'd really like to ask you, you've authored other books. You've written Irish Thunder, The Hard Life and Times of Micky Ward, Impact Statement about Whitey Bulger, the Whitey Bulger trial, and the Davis family. And what was for you the best part of writing White Devil and the most difficult part?
Okay. The best part, I think, was talking with John. And I always enjoy the research. But meeting him and getting into his mind and trying to understand his rationalizations for the way he behaved, and speaking more with pride than with regret. And so I found that interesting. But the hardest part was confirming his stories. And very quickly, one example is that he tells me about a friend of his named Wing, who was shot and killed in a parking lot. And he says that was the first murder that really affected him, because Wing was his good friend and things like that. So I said, okay, so Wing, what's his first name? And he goes, I don't know, we just called him Wing. I said, okay, so what year did this happen? He said, maybe 91, 92, something like that. I go, all right. So now I'm starting to do the research on a guy named Wing, who got killed in a parking lot. And I couldn't find it, and I was actually, at some point, I started to look at other things. And while I was doing that, I saw that a guy named Shi Jiang was killed in a rain-soaked parking lot in 93 or something like that. And part of John's story was right after the guy was shot and killed, it just started pouring rain, and the guy's mother, Wing's mother, showed up, and he had to get in the car with some of Wing's blood on and to explain to her that that her son had just been killed. And so rain-soaked parking lot jumped out at me, and I emailed John, and I said, any chance Wing is Shi Jiang? He goes, yeah, that's him. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of those kind of names to remember.
Yes, and the other things, there were American names. We were going around with a guy named Sam or Bill or whatever, and then you find out that that person is actually Chinese with a very Chinese name. So when he's been arrested, that's how you have to research him. You're not looking for Bill anymore or Sam. You're looking for Truong Chi Truong or something, and I go, all right, here we go. So
did you ever get a chance to meet An, his wife?
Yes, I interviewed her for quite some time.
And what was she like?
Beautiful, striking right off the bat. She walked into the Cheesecake Factory in Braintree, and I was like, whoa, hello, An. And, and very smart, very intelligent, very driven. And so again, very confusing to me why this woman who is, according to her, 3 credits shy of a college degree when she met John, dropped out of school and started hanging out with a gangster. Her daughter at that time was in Vietnam with her grandmother. And John said, "Why don't you bring, Mylin here and we'll raise her?" And she goes, "Okay." Mm-hmm. So a guy with the gun on his hip and the whole bit, she's gonna like bring the daughter at a young age, and so those types of things are just confusing to me because she had a different path. She had a much clearer path towards success in life, but she was drawn to John for other reasons, and
but you even admitted that talking to him for 4 hours went like that because he was so smart.
He's
and
engaging,
so charming.
Yep.
So I guess she must have seen that same thing. Not only that, but a big protective
and he was good to her. He was good to her. So there's no doubt about that. And so both of them sort of feel like there's a personal responsibility. He says to me, "If I have to hurt you, you did something. I don't want to hurt you, but you clearly must have done something to make me do it." The same is true with the drugs. I say, you ruin people's lives by selling them drugs. No, they ruin their lives. They're the ones doing the drugs. They have to take the personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. I'm a businessman, and he's a good businessman according to him. If he were selling widgets, he'd be the best widget salesman ever. Instead, he's selling drugs, so he feels like he has a clear conscience on anything he's done because he only did it because he had to. And other people are at fault for making him do it.
Kind of like a spin on white guy, Asian Mafia, Breaking Bad.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, yeah.
Bob, I want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks.
Everybody, this is a great book, White Devil, the true story of the first white Asian crime boss. And come to hear Bob Halloran at the Milton Public Library on April 28th. 2016. So thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you the next time on It's All Right with Suzette.